earthquake. That is the predominant metaphor politicians, media commentators, and headline writers have been using to describe the impact of the Brexit referendum, a tectonic convulsion in which British voters decisively opted, on June 23, to exit the European Union. Brexit earthquake has happened, and the rubble will take years to clear, declared the title of a column by Raphael Beer in the UK's Guardian, a stalwartly pro-EU, left-wing daily. Politics as practiced for a generation is upended, said Beer. Traditional party allegiances are shredded, the Prime Minister's authority is bust, and that is just the parochial domestic fallout. A whole continent looks on in trepidation. It was meant to be unthinkable. Now the thought has become action. Europe cannot be the same again. Similar expressions of shock and disbelief echoed throughout the globalist firmament. The week Britain's Brexit earthquake shook the world. Huffington Post, USA. Brexit economic shock equivalent to natural disaster, says OECD. The Independent, UK. Earthquake in Europe. Le Point, France. Brexit an earthquake in London. Atlantic Council, USA. Earthquake, indeed, and the global political, economic, social, and psychological tremors from the Brexit vote may be reverberating for many years to come. However, too few Americans, it seems, appreciate the profound significance of this recent seismic event, which, arguably, could be placed somewhere around a 9.0 plus on the political Richter scale. This American detachment is not surprising since our establishment media, except for the financial pages, largely ignored Brexit coverage until the final weeks and days before the vote. And what sparse media coverage we did receive overwhelmingly echoed the extraordinary Project Fear propaganda campaign unleashed against the Brexit by British Prime Minister David Cameron, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, President Barack Obama, billionaire investor George Soros, the International Monetary Fund, the global banking establishment, the prima donna politicos of the European Union, and the globalist policy elites of the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, and British Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA. According to Project Fear apostles, if the British voted to leave the EU, their economy would crash, their jobs and pensions would vaporize, global markets would collapse, the seas would turn to blood, and Godzilla would eat London. Remarkably, British vote has turned out in force anyway, and, defying all predictions and conventional wisdom, sent a resounding message: bye-bye, EU, we're leaving. Brexit, a shot across the bow. Why is that Brexit message so profoundly important? Well, it is the first reversal to the European project, aka, the project, since the EU was launched as the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, in 1951. Even more, it was a shot across the bow of the New World Order, the globalist scheme for world government, of which the European Union is the chief regional building block, and the model for all similar regional arrangements. In the nearly 7 decades since its launch, the project has transmogrified from the ECSC, an organization of 6 member states, West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, with supranational authority over coal and steel production, into, next, the European Economic Community, the Common Market, then the European Community, EC, and now, the European Union, EU. Each of these momentous steps has involved the gradual, but accelerating, transfer of what had previously been attributes and powers of sovereign nations to a centralized, shadowy bureaucracy in Brussels, Belgium. And as each of these fateful steps has been taken, European leaders have assured their citizens that the developing project would safeguard the essential features of their national sovereignty and independence, and that the new European collective would be characterized by transparency and accountability. The actual experience has been quite the opposite, with unaccountable, corrupt elites in Brussels constantly taking more and more money, and usurping more and more power, and then using that power and money to coerce and bribe national politicians and constituencies into providing still more power and money to the Eurocrat elites. But angry British voters have said, enough. No more. We're taking our country back. The Brexit vote is a stiff rebuke to the economic and political integration and harmonization process that in Eurospeak is also known as widening and deepening. The constant adding of new members, widening, and the relentless usurpation of jurisdiction over more and more domestic affairs, deepening. This inexorable usurpation process has proceeded by mere bureaucratic edict, as well as via deceptive treaties with hidden agendas that are only discovered years or decades after ratification. These include the Treaty of Rome, 1957, the European Communities Act, 1972, the Single European Act, 1986, the Schengen Agreement, 1990, the Maastricht Treaty, 1992, the Amsterdam Treaty, 1998, the Treaty of Nice, 2000, and the Lisbon Treaty, 2007. The 1957 Treaty of Rome, now considered the cornerstone of the EU legal documents, called for an ever closer union, a phrase that has become much hated by independence-minded citizens who recognize in it the psychological germ for the incessant push for economic and political union under a centralized superstate. Of the numerous EU usurpation issues that have rankled British voters, fishery policies, agricultural subsidies, regulatory overkill, taxation, criminal justice, defense and social policies, etc., the one that has played the most crucial role in the recent referendum has been the matter of migration and refugees. The massive migrant crisis of 2015, which is continuing unabated, was the wake-up call. A continuation of this dangerous trend would spell national and cultural suicide. Having given up control over their borders to the EU under the 1990 Schengen Agreement, EU member states watched helplessly as 1.5 million refugees, overwhelmingly Muslim, flooded into Europe during 2015, thanks to the connivance of EU and United Nations officials. Fortunately for Ireland and the United Kingdom, they had opted out of Schengen, which the EU insists is only a temporary exemption, and were able to assert control over their borders. Nevertheless, the Cameron government, like the Labour governments before him, has allowed hundreds of thousands more EU migrants, including Muslim refugees, into the UK than he had originally claimed. Elites versus the people. The Brexit victory was a victory for British people over their betters, the elite governing classes and chattering classes of big government, big media, big finance, and big business. But the anti-Brexit, pro-EU elites are not accepting the mandate of the referendum. When they were more confident the vote would go their way, they insisted the results of the referendum would be irreversible. Now rising, orchestrated chorus of voices is insisting no doesn't mean no, out doesn't mean out, leave doesn't mean leave, and Brexit doesn't mean that Britain can, should, or must exit the European Union. In fact, says the chorus, it means that the ignorant Leave voters should be ignored, and either Parliament, or a second, third, or fourth referendum, should decide. In other words, we'll keep redoing the referendum until UK voters reach the correct outcome, that is, to remain in the EU. As we will show, this tactic has been used repeatedly to overturn referendum verdicts that contradicted the globalists' ever closer union mandate. Brexit was a rejection of Britain's governing elite. Too bad the elites were right. That's the title of an article by one of the elite's veteran agents, Jeremy Shapiro, now research director for the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Formerly, he was a hand at the Obama-Clinton State Department, where he advised Clinton and Assistant Secretary of State Philip Gordon, CFR, on North Africa, that is, the Arab Spring policies that put Al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood regimes in place in Egypt, Libya, etc., and as an advisor to General Stanley McChrystal, CFR, where he helped formulate our disastrous policies in Afghanistan. Shapiro charges the Brexit vote shows that, like turkeys voting for Christmas, the British have opted to weaken their economy, reduce their international standing, and create massive uncertainty at a time when the world really doesn't need it. All in the name of the abstract concepts of independence and sovereignty. Typical of the arrogance of the globalist elites, Shapiro denigrates independence and sovereignty as abstract concepts, while prostrating himself in worship of equally abstract concepts of interdependence, unity, and globalization. Shapiro is a typical globalist voice in that Riemannian chorus. Why did this happen? He asks rhetorically. In the face of strong arguments from most mainstream politicians and experts of all kinds that leaving the EU would be disastrous for the country, why did so many Britons still choose to do it? Shapiro answers his own questions with the only statement in his essay that rings true: it has to do with the growing divide between the governing and the governed. He's absolutely correct with that observation. There is indeed a growing divide between the governing and the governed. But then he veers off into the predictable globalist defense of the governing elites and an excoriation of the ignorant, ungrateful governed. Who, according to the ECFR's Shapiro, are the mainstream politicians and experts of all kinds whom the ignorant Brexit bourgeoisie have defied. Why, such impartial authorities as George Soros, President Obama, and UK Treasury Chief George Osborne. And one of the links he provides is to an anti-Brexit piece from, surprise, The Economist, a propaganda organ for the Fabian socialists and one world elites for the better part of a century, that reverently cites Osborne, Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, of Goldman Sachs, IMF Chief Christine Lagarde, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, all devout members of the globalist Project Fear Choir. Shapiro, of course, is but one of many internationalists singing the praises of the Brussels elites and shrilly condemning the peasant, know-nothing Brexiteers. Among those joining him in this effort is CFR member James Straub, a contributing writer to the New York Times and Foreign Policy, both of which are globalist, CFR-aligned echo chambers, and a fellow at the Center on International Cooperation. Straub is even more blatantly arrogant than Shapiro, entitling his June 28 foreign policy piece, "It's time for the elites to rise up against the ignorant masses." And just to leave no doubt regarding his elitist disdain for the populist ignoramuses, he tells us in his subtitle, "The Brexit has laid bare the political schism of our time. It's not about the left versus the right, it's about the sane versus the mindlessly angry." The schism we see opening before us is not just about policies, but about reality, says Straub. The Brexit vote won, he declares, because the ignorant people believed the lying and cynical Brexiteers. Did I say ignorant? Straub asks. Yes, I did, he answers. Then continues, it is necessary to say that people are deluded and that the task of leadership is to undelude them. Is that elitist? Maybe it is. Maybe we have become so inclined to celebrate the authenticity of all personal conviction that it is now elitist to believe in reason, expertise, and the lessons of history. The elite denizens of the globalism/one worldism/world government camp have come out in force to decry the peasant uprising and to argue that the Brexit vote, which they had previously declared would be irreversible, when they were confident they would win, should now be reversed. The globalist insiders of the Council on Foreign Relations, Chatham House, formerly known as the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Brookings Institution, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, World Economic Forum, WEF, Aspen Institute, and the like, are at pains to insist that not only is it possible and desirable to ignore and reverse the results of the Brexit referendum, but it is absolutely essential to do so. Some members of this choir of organized internationalists bellow in belligerent tones like Shapiro and Straub, while others coo in softer, more reasonable and conciliatory tones, aiming at different audiences, but united in the same purpose. The Riemannian chorus. Other prominent bellowers and cooers in the Romanian chorus include Benes Bernanke, former chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Bernanke joined the Brookings Institution as a distinguished fellow in residence following his stint at the Fed. The key focus, he says in his Brookings blog, must be to keep the EU's overall integration process going strong. George Soros, in addition to penning a number of pro-Remain articles and providing generous funding to the anti-Brexit side, the billionaire investor, currency manipulator, and CFR member, donor, joined a number of prominent fellow one-worlders in signing the pro-EU/anti-Brexit declaration entitled, "The World Will Not Stop," a statement from leading Europeans, promoted by the European Council on Foreign Relations. Peter Sutherland, a leader of the Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg Group, ECFR, Chatham House, Goldman Sachs, and a former EU commissioner, Sutherland is the United Nations Special Representative for International Migration who is largely responsible for the disastrous refugee migration tsunami that is swamping Europe and fanning the flames of Brexit fever across the EU. However, far from showing any contrition for his role in the migration crisis, the ardent Europhile has been defiant in press statements and media appearances. Leaving the EU, he declares, would be an act of insanity. Richard Haass, as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Haass is an outspoken opponent of Brexit and a devotee of European political and economic integration as a regional stepping stone to world government. Appearing on CNBC following the vote, he declared the Brexit is playing with history, and people are going to look back on this and they're going to say, this was a colossal mistake. The Brexit vote shows the danger of governing by referendum, Haass argued. People went to the polls without the full understanding of the consequences of what they were setting in motion. Martin Wolf, as chief financial commentator at the establishment Financial Times, one of the UK's principal organs of globalism, Wolf is a key EU propagandist for an ever-closer union, and one of the most influential faux journalists who is a regular attendee at the secretive Bilderberg conferences. In his post-Brexit column, Brexit will reconfigure the UK economy, which the CFR website placed at the top of its must-reads of the week, Wolf worries that Brexit represents a revolt against the establishment, political, economic and commercial. Meanwhile, those who consider themselves losers and those who resent the changes in their country, notably the mass immigration, have won. They have torn down the structures built up by the establishment over half a century. The empire strikes back. The globalist elites are raging and conniving. They do not accept rejection and they do not intend to honor the popular mandate delivered by the Brexit referendum. They are not about to settle for Britain actually leaving the project. However, it is not only British Eurosceptics who are becoming increasingly aware of the tyrannical agenda behind the soothing EU rhetoric and promises. As our article #Brexit to #Amexit, Keep the Momentum Going makes clear, the ignorant masses all over Europe are getting clued into the, now not so hidden, agenda, and Brexit contagion is spreading. And not a moment too soon, the organized globalists have all but closed the trap they have skillfully laid in place over the course of decades. The CFR and RIA insiders, who were the key operatives in launching the EU project after World War II, are still pulling all the strings they can to turn the Brexit victory to defeat, and they will succeed, unless resolute, informed action is taken by Brexiteers all over the world. And truly informed action cannot be taken without an understanding of the truly conspiratorial, evil nature of the EU project, beneath its phony patina of peace, unity, and cooperation. The most informative account of the conspiratorial history of the common market EU and the role of the American and British elite insiders in organizing the movement for a united Europe can be found in a 6-part report on the common market that appeared in installments in the authoritative H. Dubey reports during 1972 and 1973. Written by the late Hilaire Duberrier, who published his superbly researched intelligence reports from Monte Carlo, Monaco, for more than 30 years, The Story of the Common Market series detailed the intrigues of the CFREA Atlantic Council Bilderberger Trilateral Commission elites. Du Berrier, who was for many years a contributing editor to this magazine, as well as its predecessor, American Opinion, was one of the few informed experts exposing the globalist EU scheme decades before the threat became patently obvious to all except the willfully blind. His in-depth research informed this writer's early articles on the Common Market EU, including my detailed history article, United States of Europe, which appeared in the April 10, 1989 issue of the New American, and is available online. The CFR, wrote Du Berrier in January 1973, saw the common market from the first as a regional government to which more and more nations would be added until the world government which, the UN had failed to bring about would be realized. At a favorable point in the common market's development, America would be brought in. But the American public had to be softened first and leaders groomed for the changeover. The CFREA globalists are now, more than 40 years after Du Berrier's prophetic warning, pushing ahead with the scheme to bring in America, by way of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. Right now the elites are moving to sabotage the Brexit, using pages ripped from their playbook that have worked in the past. The most obvious ploy, which is being promoted by many influential figures, is to call for a revote, a tactic that has paid off repeatedly for the Euro-federalists. When Danish voters rejected the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, for instance, they were forced into a revote the following year. And after being subjected to a months-long campaign of sustained threats, bribes, promises, and propaganda, they caved in and adopted the Maastricht Accord. In 2005, French and Dutch voters turned thumbs down on the proposed EU constitution, providing one of the biggest defeats in the project's history. That obstacle was overcome by the globalists, however, with the simple maneuver of relabeling the EU constitution as the Lisbon Treaty and imposing it as treaty law. When Ireland, the only country that held a national referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, rejected it in 2008, they were subjected to a revote the following year. Again, after much threatening, bribing, and politicking, the outcome was reversed. In the case of Brexit, no sooner had the earthquake rumbled than the revote lobby was out in force, among whom are former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt, a member of Cameron's Conservative Party and a Member of Parliament, Tim Farron, leader of the Liberal Democrats, Jarosław Kaczynski, former Polish Prime Minister, Soron Mojza, Member of the European Parliament, Philip Stevens, columnist for the Financial Times, Baroness Una King, a Labour Party Member of Parliament, and many more. Of course, one of the most troubling developments is the selection, by Parliament, of Theresa May to replace Cameron as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party. Not only was she a disaster on migration, refugees as David Cameron's Home Secretary, but she campaigned against Brexit. Her assurances that she will now honour the desire of the electorate and use her new office to negotiate a new Eurosceptic relationship with the EU is hardly reassuring. Tony Blair, David Cameron, and other occupants of 10 Downing Street have made similar pledges, before jumping into bed with the Euro-federalists. Brexit was an important shot across the bow, but the battle for sovereignty and for genuine representative government, and against plutocratic absolutism, continued.